Okay, let's continue with chapter 2. Down the street, Mrs. Hobbs asked the boys to water the plants in her kitchen. Some of her plants were hanging high in the air. Little Shaq reached up to water them. They were green and leafy. He wondered how Mrs. Hobbs ever watered them without him. Next door, Miss Emerson's sunroom was lined wall to wall with plants of all shapes and sizes. It was like a jungle. There were so many plants, Little Shaq was afraid he might knock them over. Barry knew just what to do. Taking tiny steps, he squeezed down the rows, sprinkling the plants as he went. Barry even watered the prickly cactus all the way in the corner. Little Shaq thought they made a good team. At the end of the block, Mr. Rodriguez had a great big vegetable garden. He grew all kinds of vegetables like eggplant, corn, and zucchini, but his tomatoes were famous. Every summer, he mixed them into a spicy salsa that he served at the neighborhood block party. It tasted so good, there was always a line to get some. Barry pushed the red wagon into Mr. Rodriguez's backyard. He was careful to steer it clear of a few muddy patches so the wheels wouldn't get stuck. Little Shaq lifted a blue watering can. "Mine is almost empty," he said. "Mine too," Barry replied. "Look, there's a hose." "Good idea," said Little Shaq. "If you turn on the water, I'll fill the cans." Barry turned the round knob on the water tap. Little Shaq waited, but nothing came out. "Turn it again," said Little Shaq. Barry turned the knob once more. Suddenly, a stream of water gushed out of the hose. "Ack!" Little Shaq yelled. He was soaking wet. The hose slipped out of his hands and snaked across the yard, spraying water everywhere. "Shut it off, Barry!" he yelled. "Shut it off!" Little Shaq ran after the hose, but the ground was now covered in even more mud. His feet slipped and his legs scissored back and forth. The next thing he knew, he was toppling into the garden, knocking over plants left and right. "Oh no," Little Shaq yelled, "Mr. Rodriguez's tomatoes." Barry turned off the water and hurried over to help. "Are you okay, Little Shaq?" Barry's feet slipped too. He landed in a puddle of mud. Splat! Mr. Rodriguez came outside to see what all the noise was about. Barry and Little Shaq were covered in mud from head to toe. "I'm really sorry," Barry said. "It was my fault. I turned the water on too strong." "No," said Little Shaq, "it was my fault. I let go of the hose." Mr. Rodriguez smiled. "It's all right, boys." Mr. Rodriguez picked up the hose. "It looks like the nozzle was turned too high." "It was my fault." "But your garden, your tomato plants," said Little Shaq, "they're ruined." "Well, let's see what we can do about that." Once Little Shaq and Barry had cleaned up inside, they joined Mr. Rodriguez out in the garden. He showed them how to dig a hole and replant the tomatoes, packing in the soil tight. When they had finished, the garden was as good as new. Mr. Rodriguez told them they had a career ahead of them. Little Shaq liked the sound of that. He could see it now. O'Neill's is gardening, watering and planting experts. Little Shaq and Barry packed up their things and said thank you to Mr. Rodriguez. It was time to go home. And that's the end of chapter 2. Our next chapter is layups and turnips.